Dakota Matthews stared at her computer screen, the harsh blue light illuminating her face in the darkness of her home office. It was 11:47 p.m., long past her usual bedtime, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. The spreadsheet before her told a story she wouldn't believe, yet the numbers didn't lie. She scrolled through the joint account statements again, her heart racing. Nearly $47,000 had disappeared over the past 3 months in a series of small, irregular transfers. As an architect who'd built her career on attention to detail, Dakota prided herself on catching discrepancies, but these transactions had somehow slipped past her weekly account reviews. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. She pushed back from her ergonomic chair, the wheels silent against the plush carpet she'd selected during their home renovation 2 years ago. Everything in their Rosedale Victorian spoke of careful planning and shared dreams she'd built with Jackson over their 15 years of marriage. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system. Jackson was away at what he'd called a crucial client meeting in Vancouver. It wasn't unusual for him to travel for his investment consulting work, but lately, these trips had become more frequent and longer. Dakota pulled up their shared calendar, something nagging at her consciousness. The Vancouver meeting wasn't listed. In fact, none of his recent trips appeared on their usually meticulously maintained schedule. She opened their credit card statements, her throat tightening as she scanned the entries. There it was, a charge from the Four Seasons Hotel, in Montreal, not Vancouver. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from Alberta, her mother-in-law. "Hope Jackson's presentation goes well tomorrow. So proud of my boy-making partner." Dakota's heart stopped. Partner? Jackson hadn't mentioned anything about a promotion. And why would Alberta know about it before she did? She opened her email, searching for any communication from Jackson's firm, Riverside Investment Partners. Nothing. But there, in her spam folder, was an email she'd missed from 3 weeks ago. The sender was unfamiliar. Savannah. Parker, at Riverside. Calm. With shaking hands, she opened the message. It was brief. "Jack, honey, I've booked our usual room for next week. Can't wait to celebrate your partnership announcement properly. Love, Essa." The room spun. Dakota gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The missing money, the secret trips, the mysterious promotion, and Savannah, the new junior partner she'd met at last year's Christmas party, the one who'd laughed too loudly at Jackson's jokes and touched his arm too often. She printed everything. Bank statements, credit card bills, the damning email. Her architectural training had taught her to build strong foundations, and she needed evidence to confront the collapse of her marriage. As she gathered the papers, her wedding ring caught the light, mocking her with its promise of forever. The sound of a key in the front door made her freeze. Jackson wasn't due back until tomorrow. She heard his familiar footsteps in the foyer, then the thud of his briefcase hitting the marble floor. "Dakota!" his voice called out. "Why are all the lights on?" She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. The papers trembled in her hands as she stood, smoothing her silk pajama pants. A birthday gift from Jackson just 2 months ago. "I'm in the office," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. Jackson appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled. He looked exactly the same as he had that morning when he'd kissed her goodbye, yet somehow completely different. "Honey, what are you doing up so late?" He stepped toward her, then stopped short when he saw the papers in her hands. "What's all that?" Dakota met his gaze, her voice ice cold. "Funny thing. I was about to ask you the same thing about your trip to Montreal. Or was it Vancouver? I seem to be having trouble keeping track of your schedule these days, Jackson. Almost as much trouble as I'm having tracking our money." The color drained from his face. "Dakota, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," she cut him off, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "And you will. Starting with Savannah Parker and ending with the $47,000 you've been siphoning from our accounts." Jackson's face contorted, cycling through shock, guilt, and finally, a calculated calm. "You've got it all wrong, Dakota. Those transfers, they're for a surprise investment. I was going to tell you once it matured." Dakota laughed bitterly. "A surprise investment? Is that what you're calling your affair with Savannah now?" "Savannah? What are you talking about?" Jackson's attempt at innocence was almost convincing. Almost. Don't, Dakota's voice cracked. Don't you dare lie to me anymore. I saw the email, Jackson. I know about the usual room and the partnership celebration. Jackson's facade crumbled. He slumped against the doorframe, suddenly looking much older than his 42 years. I never meant for this to happen, Dakota. It got out of hand. Out of hand. Dakota's voice rose. You've been stealing our money and cheating on me, and you say it got out of hand? She thrust the papers at him, her hands shaking. I want you out of this house, tonight. And tomorrow, we're going to sit down with lawyers and figure out exactly what you've done with our money. Jackson straightened, a flash of anger crossing his face. You can't just throw me out. This is my house, too. Is it? Dakota's voice was cold. Because from what I can see, you've been busy building a life with someone else, using our money to do it. They stood there, the weight of 15 years hanging between them. Dakota could see the moment Jackson realized it was over. His shoulders sagged, and the fight went out of his eyes. I'll go to a hotel, he said quietly. We can talk tomorrow. Dakota watched silently as he packed a bag, her mind racing with all the questions she still had, all the answers she wasn't sure she wanted. As the front door closed behind him, she sank to the floor, her back against the cool wall, and let the tears finally come. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching Dakota's mood perfectly. She'd barely slept, her mind a whirlwind of questions and half-formed plans. The house felt eerily quiet without Jackson's presence, a silence that seemed to mock the life they'd built together. She sat at the kitchen island, clutching a mug of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink, when her phone buzzed. It was Tyler, her colleague from the architecture firm and one of her closest friends. Hey Dee, you okay? You're never late for work. Dakota glanced at the clock, realizing with a start that it was almost 10 a.m. Tyler, something's happened. Can you cover for me today? There was a pause on the other end. Of course. Do you need anything? Should I come over? The concern in his voice nearly broke her composure. No, I need to handle some things, but thank you. After hanging up, Dakota forced herself into action. She showered, dressed in a crisp white shirt and black slacks, armor for the battle ahead, and called her bank. I need to freeze all joint accounts immediately, she told the representative, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. Next, she called Brooklyn Chen, a lawyer she'd met through a women's business networking event. Brooklyn's reputation for handling complex divorces was well known in Toronto's professional circles. Dakota, I'm so sorry you're going through this, Brooklyn said after Dakota had explained the situation. You did the right thing gathering evidence. Can you come to my office this afternoon? We need to act quickly to protect your assets. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls and emails. Dakota canceled credit cards, changed passwords, and started compiling financial records. Each action felt like another nail in the coffin of her marriage, but also like a step towards reclaiming control. At 2 p.m., she found herself in Brooklyn's sleek downtown office, surrounded by the evidence of her unraveling life. Based on what you've shown me, Brooklyn said, her dark eyes sharp and focused, we have a strong case for financial fraud. But Dakota, I have to ask, are you sure you want to pursue this? Some clients prefer a quieter settlement to avoid public scrutiny. Dakota thought of the life she'd built, the trust she'd given so freely. I'm sure. I want the truth, all of it, no matter how ugly. Brooklyn nodded, a small smile of approval on her face. Then let's get to work. First, we need to file for an emergency injunction to prevent Jackson from accessing or moving any more funds. As they pored over documents and strategized, Dakota felt a strange mix of grief and determination. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life at 40, facing divorce and financial ruin, but she'd be damned if she'd let Jackson's betrayal define her. It was nearly 7 p.m. when Dakota finally left Brooklyn's office, armed with a plan and a stack of legal documents. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a text from Jackson. We need to talk, please. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand answers. Another part, the part that still remembered the man she'd fallen in love with, wanted to give him a chance to explain. In the end, she typed a simple response. Only with lawyers present. That night, as she lay in their bed, now feeling too large and empty, Dakota allowed herself to cry again. She cried for the life she'd lost, for the future she'd planned, for the trust that had been shattered. But as the tears subsided, a steely resolve took their place. She'd rebuild, stronger this time, on a foundation of her own making. 3 days later, Dakota sat across from Jackson in a conference room at Brooklyn's law firm. The polished oak table between them felt like a chasm, wider than the 15 years they'd spent building a life together. Jackson looked haggard, his usually immaculate appearance marred by dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled shirt. His lawyer, Richard Blackwood, sat beside him, exuding an air of practiced confidence that set Dakota's teeth on edge. "Before we begin," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oil, "my client would like to express his deep regret for any misunderstanding that may have occurred." Dakota felt Brooklyn stiffen beside her. "Misunderstanding?" Brooklyn's voice was sharp. "Mr. Blackwood, we're here to discuss your client's systematic fraud and infidelity, not a misunderstanding." Jackson leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Dakota, please. If you'd just let me explain." "Explain what, Jackson?" Dakota interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "How you've been stealing our money? Or how you've been sleeping with your coworker?" "It's not like that," Jackson protested. "The money. It was an investment opportunity. I was trying to secure our future." Brooklyn slid a folder across the table. "An investment opportunity that required secret accounts in the Cayman Islands? Mr. Matthews, we have documentation of transfers totaling over $200,000 to offshore accounts in your name alone." The color drained from Jackson's face. He turned to his lawyer, who was frowning at the documents. "We'll need time to review these allegations," Blackwood said smoothly. "In the meantime, perhaps we can discuss a temporary arrangement for living situations and expenses." Dakota felt a surge of anger. "Living situations?" Jackson moved out. "He can stay out. Now, Mrs. Matthews," Blackwood began, his tone patronizing, "surely we can come to a more amicable—" "It's Ms. Matthews," Dakota cut in, her voice like steel, "and there's nothing amicable about fraud and betrayal." The next 2 hours were a blur of legal terms and thinly veiled accusations. Jackson alternated between looking defeated and defiant, while Blackwood tried to poke holes in Brooklyn's evidence. But Brooklyn was relentless, presenting document after document that painted a damning picture of Jackson's financial misconduct. As the meeting drew to a close, Jackson made one last attempt. "Dakota, I know I've made mistakes, but 15 years. Doesn't that count for something? Can't we try to work this out?" Dakota met his gaze, searching for any trace of the man she'd married. All she saw was desperation and fear. "No, Jackson, we can't. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we built together." Outside the conference room, Brooklyn squeezed Dakota's arm gently. "You did well in there, but this is just the beginning. Are you ready for what comes next?" Dakota thought of the home she'd have to sell, the explanations she'd have to give to friends and family, the long legal battle ahead. But she also thought of the strength she'd found in herself over the past few days. "I'm ready," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Whatever it takes." As she walked out of the law firm into the crisp Toronto afternoon, Dakota felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The life she'd known was over, but a new chapter was beginning. And this time, she'd be the sole architect of her future. In the weeks that followed, Dakota's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and financial investigations. She'd taken a leave of absence from her architecture firm, much to the concern of her colleagues. Tyler, ever supportive, had become her lifeline to the world of normality she'd left behind. One rainy afternoon, Dakota sat in Brooklyn's office, poring over a new set of documents. The room smelled of coffee and determination, with stacks of papers covering every available surface. "Look at this," Brooklyn said, sliding a printout across the desk. "We found a pattern. Every time Jackson made a transfer from your joint account, there was a corresponding deposit into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Dakota leaned forward, studying the transaction dates. Her architect's eye for detail caught the rhythm in the numbers. "These align perfectly with his business trips," she said, making air quotes with her fingers, her voice bitter. Brooklyn nodded, her dark eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting." She pulled out another sheet. Remember that forensic accountant I recommended? He found something crucial. Jackson wasn't just moving your money. He was using your joint accounts to launder funds from his investment clients. Dakota's stomach lurched. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. Are you saying this goes beyond our divorce? That he was stealing from his clients too? That's exactly what I'm saying, Brooklyn confirmed. And this is our leverage. Jackson's not just fighting for your marriage assets anymore. If this gets out, he's looking at serious criminal charges. A knock at the door interrupted them. Tyler stood in the doorway, his familiar presence instantly comforting. As head of the architectural firm's financial department, he'd been instrumental in helping Dakota navigate the complex web of her finances. Sorry to interrupt, he said, stepping into the office. But I thought you should see this right away. He handed Brooklyn a manila envelope. Our team found these buried in the firm's archived emails. Looks like Jackson tried to use Dakota's professional credentials to secure some questionable development deals. Dakota watched as Brooklyn examined the documents, her lawyer's expression growing increasingly focused. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the legal battle, the potential criminal implications, suddenly felt overwhelming. I never thought... Dakota's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. 15 years of marriage, and I didn't see any of this coming. Tyler pulled up a chair beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Hey, don't do that to yourself. Jackson fooled everyone, including his own mother. Remember last year's charity gala? He had the whole room convinced he was donating his bonus to children's hospitals, while he was actually funneling it offshore, Brooklyn added, still reading. She looked up, her expression serious but tinged with excitement. Dakota, this is good news. With these documents, we can prove not only his financial misconduct, but also his attempt to compromise your professional integrity. Dakota stood, walking to the window. Below, the city streets were slick with rain, people hurrying by under a sea of umbrellas. Somewhere out there, Jackson was probably with Savannah, planning their next move. What happens now? She asked, pressing her hand against the cool glass. Brooklyn's reflection appeared beside her in the window. Now we prepare for the preliminary hearing. Jackson's team is calling Alberta as their first witness. They're trying to establish your supposed pattern of financial mismanagement. Tyler snorted. Alberta? The woman who still writes checks for everything and thinks online banking is a scam? Despite everything, Dakota felt a smile tugging at her lips. She once told me investing in anything but gold was foolish because the internet might crash and take all the money with it. Perfect, Brooklyn said, making notes. We can use that to challenge her credibility as a witness on financial matters. Tyler, can you pull together a summary of Dakota's successful project budgets from the firm? Already on it, Tyler replied, pulling out his tablet. I've got 5 years of spotless records showing her handling multi-million-dollar development projects without a single discrepancy. As they strategized, Dakota felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. She turned back to face her team, drawing strength from their support. Thank you both. I don't know how I would have gotten through these past weeks without you. That's what friends are for, Tyler said simply, while Brooklyn nodded in agreement. As the meeting wrapped up, Dakota gathered her things to leave. She caught her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was tired but determined, bent but not broken. She thought of her father, who'd built his firm with nothing but talent and integrity. She wouldn't let Jackson destroy that legacy. Tomorrow, she said firmly, we fight back. The Ontario Superior Court of Justice buzzed with activity as Dakota made her way through security. She smoothed down her navy blazer, a power suit she'd chosen carefully for its blend of professionalism and understated elegance. As she entered the courtroom, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Colleagues from both their firms, drawn by the salacious rumors of fraud and infidelity that had rocked Toronto's professional circles. Brooklyn was already at their table, arranging documents with practiced efficiency. Ready? She asked as Dakota took her seat. Before Dakota could answer, a hush fell over the room. Jackson entered with his legal team, looking polished in an expensive suit she'd never seen before. Their eyes met briefly, and Dakota was surprised to feel nothing. No anger, no pain, just a hollow emptiness where love had once resided. All rise, the clerk announced as Justice Eleanor Martinez entered the courtroom. Dakota stood, careful to keep her expression neutral despite the burning sensation in her stomach. Please be seated, Justice Martinez said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the documents before her. We're here today for Matthews v. Matthews, case number 2024, CV 7845. This is a preliminary hearing regarding the dissolution of marriage and disputed assets. Who represents the plaintiff? Brooklyn stood. Brooklyn Chen for the plaintiff, Your Honor. And for the defendant? Richard Blackwood for the defendant, Your Honor. Jackson's lawyer responded, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone used to winning. Justice Martinez nodded. Mr. Blackwood, you may proceed with your opening statement. Blackwood rose, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. Your Honor, this case is about more than a simple divorce. It's about a calculated attempt by Mrs. Matthews to defraud my client of his rightful assets and damage his professional reputation. We will prove that Mrs. Matthews, upon learning of my client's promotion to partner, attempted to manipulate financial records to create a false narrative of misconduct. Dakota's hands clenched in her lap. Brooklyn had warned her about this strategy. Jackson's attempt to flip the script and paint her as the villain. Still, hearing the lies spoken so confidently in court made her blood boil. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, we will demonstrate that Mrs. Matthews' accusations of infidelity are merely a smokescreen to distract from her own financial improprieties. My client has documentation showing unauthorized transfers from their joint accounts to Mrs. Matthews' personal accounts, totaling over $60,000. Dakota's head snapped up. This was new, and completely false. She scribbled a note to Brooklyn, who nodded slightly, already aware of this tactical move. When Brooklyn stood for her opening statement, her presence commanded attention despite her smaller stature. Your Honor, this case is indeed about more than divorce. It's about trust betrayed, not just in marriage but in business and law. We will present clear evidence that Mr. Matthews engaged in systematic financial deception, diverting joint assets for personal use, and attempting to conceal his actions through increasingly complex schemes. Dakota watched as several jurors leaned forward, engaged by Brooklyn's precise delivery and clear narrative. Moreover, Brooklyn continued, we will demonstrate that Mr. Matthews' accusations against my client are not only false, but represent a continuation of his pattern of manipulation and deceit. Mrs. Matthews has maintained impeccable financial records throughout her career as a respected architect, and we have documentation to prove every transaction was legitimate and transparent. As Brooklyn spoke, Dakota caught sight of Alberta, Jackson's mother, sitting in the back row. The older woman's face was set in its usual expression of disapproval, but Dakota noticed something new, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of procedural matters and preliminary motions. During the lunch recess, Dakota sat alone in a conference room, picking at a sandwich she couldn't taste. Her mind raced with the implications of Jackson's new accusations. How far was he willing to go to discredit her? Brooklyn entered with a stack of files, her expression determined. We're in good shape, she said, setting down the documents. But Jackson's team is playing dirty. That accusation about the $60,000? They fabricated it this morning. They're desperate. Dakota set down her sandwich, her appetite completely gone. How can they just lie like that in court? They can't, not without consequences, Brooklyn assured her. We'll destroy their credibility when we present our evidence. She paused, studying her client. Dakota, are you ready for this? It's going to get uglier before it gets better. Dakota thought of her father's watch, still faithfully keeping time on her wrist, the only piece of him she had left. She nodded, a steely resolve settling over her. I have to be. Dad built his architecture firm from nothing, Brooklyn. His legacy, my inheritance. I won't let Jackson steal it all away with lies. As they prepared to return to the courtroom, Dakota squared her shoulders. The afternoon session would bring Alberta to the stand, and with her, the first real test of their defense. Whatever came next, Dakota was determined to face it head-on, armed with the truth and the strength she'd discovered within herself. The courtroom fell silent as Alberta Matthews took the stand. She'd styled her silver hair into a perfect coif and wore a conservative pearl gray suit that screamed old money and country club luncheons. Dakota watched her former mother-in-law settle into the witness chair with the same regal bearing she'd displayed at countless family gatherings. Mrs. Matthews, Richard Blackwood began, his voice oozing charm. Please tell the court about your observations of the plaintiff's handling of finances during her marriage to your son. Alberta dabbed at her lips with a tissue, a gesture Dakota had seen countless times before. It always preceded what Alberta considered a difficult truth. Well, I always worried about Dakota's extravagant tendencies. She insisted on renovating their perfectly good house, spending thousands on what she called architectural improvements. My Jackson was too kind to question her decisions. Dakota felt Brooklyn tense beside her. They'd prepared for this, but hearing Alberta rewrite history still stung. Dakota's hands clenched in her lap, remembering the countless hours she'd spent poring over budgets, ensuring every renovation was not only necessary, but cost-effective. "Could you be more specific about these expenditures?" Blackwood prompted. She replaced all the original woodwork, beautiful maple that had been there since 1892, with some modern nonsense, and she was always traveling to architecture conferences, charging everything to their joint account. Brooklyn stood, her movement sharp and purposeful. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is presenting speculation as fact. We have documentation showing all renovation expenses were jointly approved, and conference expenses were covered by Mrs. Matthews' firm." "Sustained," Justice Martinez said, her tone firm. "Please stick to direct observations, Mrs. Matthews." As Alberta continued her testimony, Dakota noticed something odd. Every time she mentioned specific dates or amounts, she glanced at her handbag on the floor beside her. Brooklyn noticed too, making a quick note. During cross-examination, Brooklyn approached the witness stand with measured steps. "Mrs. Matthews, you've testified about your concerns regarding the plaintiff's financial decisions. Could you tell the court about the investment advice you gave her in 2022? Alberta straightened, a hint of pride in her voice. "I suggested she invest in physical gold. It's the only safe option in these uncertain times." "And did you advise her about online banking?" "I warned her against it. You can't trust computers with money." Brooklyn nodded, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. "Yet you're testifying about complex financial transactions and electronic transfers. How do you reconcile that with your own admitted lack of understanding of modern banking?" Alberta's composure cracked slightly. A faint flush crept up her neck. "Jackson explained everything to me." "When exactly did he explain these things to you?" Alberta's hand twitched toward her bag. Last month, when he showed me the documents." Brooklyn's voice took on a tone of polite curiosity. "Your Honor, I request that the court examine the contents of the witness's handbag. I believe Mrs. Matthews is referring to notes during her testimony." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Justice Martinez banged her gavel, the sharp crack silencing the murmurs. "Bailiff, please bring me the witness's bag." Dakota held her breath as the bailiff retrieved the handbag. Inside, they found detailed notes with dates, amounts, and specific phrases to use, all in Jackson's handwriting. The implications were clear. Alberta's testimony had been carefully scripted. Justice Martinez's expression hardened. "Mrs. Matthews, were you aware that referring to notes during testimony without the court's permission is a serious violation?" Alberta's face paled. She looked frantically between Jackson and the judge. I didn't know. Jackson said it would help me remember the details correctly." The judge turned to Blackwood. "Counselor, did you have knowledge of these notes?" Blackwood's usual smooth demeanor faltered. "No, Your Honor. I was unaware of any prepared statements." "Very well," Justice Martinez said, her tone clipped. "Mrs. Matthews' testimony is stricken from the record. Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you advise your client on the seriousness of witness tampering." As Alberta hurried from the courtroom, shoulders hunched in shame, Dakota caught Jackson's eye. For the first time since this ordeal began, she saw genuine fear in his expression. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, thread by thread. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of technical testimony from financial experts. By the time the judge called a recess for the day, Dakota felt drained but cautiously optimistic. As she gathered her things, she overheard snippets of conversation from the gallery, whispers of shock at the turn of events, speculation about what other surprises might be in store. Outside the courthouse, Brooklyn pulled Dakota aside, away from the small crowd of reporters that had gathered. "That went better than we could have hoped," she said, a rare smile breaking through her professional demeanor. "Alberta's testimony backfiring like that? It's going to be hard for Jackson's team to recover from this." Dakota nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. "What's our next move?" "Tomorrow, we bring out the big guns," Brooklyn replied, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We've got Melissa Chen from Jackson's firm ready to testify about the irregularities she found in his client accounts. And then, we dropped the bombshell about the fake charities." As they walked to the parking lot, Dakota felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but today had shown her that the truth had a power all its own. A power that could cut through even the most carefully constructed lies. The following morning dawned clear and cold, a perfect Toronto winter day. Dakota arrived early at the courthouse, finding Brooklyn already set up in their usual conference room, surrounded by papers and digital devices. "Ready for this?" Brooklyn asked, looking up from her tablet. "Today's when we lay out the full conspiracy." Dakota nodded, setting down her coffee. The nerves that had plagued her throughout the night had transformed into a steely determination. "I've been ready since I found that first suspicious transfer. What's our timeline?" "We start with the evidence from Tyler's forensic team, then move to the offshore accounts. But the real bombshell comes last." Brooklyn pulled out a thick folder. "Remember that charity gala Jackson supposedly donated to the Children's Hospital Fund?" Dakota's brow furrowed at the memory of Jackson's beaming face as he'd presented the oversized check, cameras flashing. "Right. We found where that money really went. Straight into an account shared by Jackson and Alberta. They've been running this scheme for years, using various charities as fronts for tax evasion." Dakota felt a wave of nausea. "How much?" "Millions," Brooklyn said grimly. "But before we get to that, we've got our star witness. Melissa Chen should be here any minute." As if on cue, there was a soft knock at the door. Melissa Chen entered, looking nervous but resolute. The young accountant had been a junior member of Jackson's team at Riverside Investment Partners, and her decision to come forward had been the key to unraveling the entire scheme. "Ms. Chen," Brooklyn greeted her warmly. "Thank you for being here. I know this isn't easy." Melissa nodded, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her laptop bag. "I just hope I'm doing the right thing." "You are," Dakota assured her, feeling a surge of gratitude for this woman's courage. "You're helping to expose a fraud that's hurt a lot of people." As Brooklyn prepped Melissa for her testimony, Dakota excused herself to use the restroom. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Jackson, who was emerging from a conference room with his legal team. For a moment, they stood frozen, staring at each other. Jackson looked haggard, the polished veneer of the successful investment consultant stripped away. "Dakota," he began, his voice low and urgent. "Please, can we talk? There's so much you don't understand." "Save it for the court, Jackson," Dakota cut him off, her voice steady. "I understand plenty." She brushed past him, feeling his eyes on her back as she walked away. The encounter left her shaken, but also more certain than ever that she was doing the right thing. The courtroom was packed when proceedings began. News of yesterday's developments had spread, drawing even more spectators. Dakota noticed several of Jackson's former clients among the crowd, their expressions grim. Brooklyn's presentation was masterful. She wove together bank records, witness statements, and electronic evidence into an undeniable narrative of fraud and betrayal. The documents showed how Jackson had systematically abused his position of trust, both as a husband and as a financial advisor. When Melissa Chen took the stand, the room fell silent. Despite her obvious nervousness, her testimony was clear and damning. "Ms. Chen," Brooklyn began, "could you tell the court about the irregularities you noticed in Mr. Matthews' client accounts?" Melissa spoke softly, but clearly. "I discovered discrepancies in several investment accounts Mr. Matthews managed. Clients' funds were being routed through a series of shell companies before reaching their intended investments. Some never reached their destinations at all." "And what did you do with this information?" "I reported it to Mr. Matthews directly, assuming it was an oversight. He told me he'd handle it, but the transactions continued. When I threatened to report it to the compliance department, he—" Melissa paused, swallowing hard. "He threatened to ruin my career." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Dakota glanced at Jackson, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. As the evidence mounted throughout the afternoon, Dakota watched Jackson's face grow increasingly pale. When Brooklyn presented documents showing Jackson had used Dakota's electronic signature to authorize transfers, a clear case of fraud, he actually grabbed Blackwood's arm in panic. "Your Honor," Brooklyn said, approaching the bench with a final set of documents. These records show that Mr. Matthews didn't just defraud his wife and clients. He created an elaborate network of fake charities, using his mother's social connections to lend them legitimacy, while funneling the donations offshore. Jackson's lawyer jumped up. Objection. These allegations go beyond the scope of this divorce proceeding. Overruled, Justice Martinez said firmly. Given that these activities directly involve joint marital assets, they are relevant to these proceedings. Continue, Ms. Chen. As Brooklyn detailed the extent of Jackson's crimes, Dakota watched various expressions cross his face: defiance, fear, and finally, defeat. When the evidence about the charities was presented, several society matrons in the gallery gasped audibly. They'd all contributed generously to Jackson's supposed causes. By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere in the room was electric. Dakota felt drained but oddly exhilarated. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like the truth was finally coming to light. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for statements. Dakota let Brooklyn handle the press while she slipped away, needing a moment to process everything that had happened. In a quiet corner of the courthouse, she found herself face to face with Alberta. Jackson's mother looked shaken, her usual haughty demeanor replaced by genuine distress. "Did you know?" Dakota asked quietly. "About the charities?" Alberta shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I swear I had no idea. I thought I was helping people." As Alberta hurried away, Dakota felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, pity, and a strange sense of closure. The life she'd known was gone, but from its ashes, a new truth was emerging. The following days saw a flurry of activity both in and out of the courtroom. As news of Jackson's fraud spread, more victims came forward. The case had ballooned from a contentious divorce to a full-blown financial crime investigation. Dakota found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside her home, shouting questions every time she left for the courthouse. Brooklyn had advised her to maintain a dignified silence, but the constant scrutiny was wearing. One evening, as Dakota was reviewing documents with Brooklyn in her home office, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Tyler on her doorstep, holding bags of takeout. "Thought you could use a break," he said with a gentle smile. "And maybe some actual food." Grateful for the distraction, Dakota welcomed him in. As they sat around her kitchen island, sharing containers of pad thai and spring rolls, she felt some of the tension of the past weeks begin to ease. "How are you really doing?" Tyler asked, his eyes full of concern. Dakota pushed a piece of tofu around with her fork. I don't know, angry, exhausted, relieved in a way. Does that make sense?" Tyler nodded. "Completely. You're finally getting answers, but they're not easy ones to hear." "It's not just that," Dakota sighed. "It's every day I learn something new about Jackson, about the life we had. It makes me question everything. Were any of the good memories real?" Brooklyn, who had been quietly eating her dinner, spoke up. "Dakota, don't let Jackson take those from you too. Your memories, your experiences, they were real to you. His actions don't negate the life you lived." Dakota felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by her friend's support. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." As they were cleaning up, Dakota's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart raced as she read it. "We need to talk. Meet me at our spot. Jay." "What is it?" Tyler asked, noticing her expression. Dakota showed them the message. "It's from Jackson. He wants to meet—" Brooklyn's eyes narrowed. "Absolutely not. Any communication should go through lawyers at this point." "I agree," Tyler said firmly. "It's not safe, Dakota. Who knows what he's planning?" But Dakota felt a pull she couldn't explain. I think I need to do this. To get closure." Despite her friend's protests, Dakota found herself driving to Riverdale Park an hour later. It was their spot, the place where Jackson had proposed 15 years ago, overlooking the city skyline. She spotted him sitting on a bench, hunched against the cold. As she approached, he looked up, his face a mask of misery. "Dakota," he said, standing. "Thank you for coming." "Make it quick, Jackson," she replied, keeping her distance. "What do you want?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "I wanted to explain, to apologize. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to understand." Understand what? Dakota felt her anger rising. How you lied to me for years. How you stole from me, from your clients, from charities. I never meant for it to go this far, Jackson pleaded. It started small. Just a little creative accounting to boost my numbers at work. But then it grew, and I couldn't stop. I was afraid of losing everything, my job, my reputation. You. Dakota laughed bitterly. Well, congratulations. You've lost it all anyway. I know, he said quietly. And I deserve it. But Dakota, you have to believe me. What we had was real. I loved you. I still do. For a moment, Dakota felt her resolve waver. But then she thought of all the lies, all the betrayal, and she steeled herself. If you ever loved me, Jackson, you'll do the right thing now. Turn yourself in. Make amends. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her cold. I can't go to prison, Dakota. I won't survive it. She looked back at him, really seeing him for the first time. Not the successful consultant, not the charming husband, but a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. That's not my problem anymore, Jackson, she said softly. Goodbye. As she walked away, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she knew she'd be okay. The final day of the trial dawned bright and clear. Dakota dressed carefully in a tailored charcoal suit, her father's watch a comforting weight on her wrist. As she entered the courthouse, she was surprised to find a familiar face waiting for her. Melissa, she said, greeting the young accountant. What are you doing here? Melissa smiled nervously. I wanted to see it through, and to apologize. I should have come forward sooner. Dakota shook her head. You did the right thing when it mattered most. Thank you. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Jackson sat with his legal team, looking pale and defeated. As Justice Martinez took her seat, a hush fell over the room. Before I deliver my ruling, the judge began, I want to address the parties directly. This case has revealed a disturbing pattern of deception and financial misconduct that goes far beyond the usual disputes of a marital dissolution. Mr. Matthews, your actions have not only betrayed the trust of your wife, but also of your clients and the charities you claim to support. She turned to Dakota. Mrs. Matthews, this court commends your diligence in uncovering this fraud and your commitment to seeing justice done, not just for yourself, but for all those affected. Justice Martinez paused, removing her glasses. In light of the evidence presented, I am granting the divorce on the grounds of financial misconduct and adultery. All marital assets will be awarded to Mrs. Matthews, including the full value of the offshore accounts that have been frozen. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Dakota felt a rush of emotions, relief, vindication, and a tinge of sadness for the end of a chapter in her life. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am referring this case to the Crown for criminal prosecution. Mr. Matthews, you will surrender your passport and report to the authorities immediately. As the gavel fell, sealing the judgment, Dakota looked at Jackson. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she'd once loved. Remorseful, scared, human. Then it was gone, replaced by resignation as officers approached to take him into custody. Outside the courthouse, Dakota faced a sea of reporters. With Brooklyn at her side, she made a brief statement. Today, justice was served, not just for me, but for all the people hurt by this fraud. I hope this case serves as a reminder that financial crimes have real victims and real consequences. As for me, I'm looking forward to rebuilding my life and my career. As the crowd dispersed, Dakota found herself surrounded by a small group of supporters, Tyler, Melissa, and even Alberta, who approached hesitantly. Dakota, I'm so sorry, Alberta said, her voice thick with emotion. I should have seen what was happening. Can you ever forgive me? Dakota took a deep breath. It'll take time, Alberta, but I believe you were a victim too. Maybe we can both heal from this. As they talked, Dakota felt a sense of closure settling over her. The road ahead would be challenging. She had a career to rebuild, a home to sell, a life to reimagine. But for the first time in months, she felt hope. That evening, as Dakota sat in her home office, soon to be packed up and moved, she found herself sketching. Not buildings or renovations, but a new design. A design for her life, built on a foundation of truth, integrity, and the strength she discovered within herself. The sketch took shape. A bridge, spanning from her past to her future. And as she drew, Dakota realized that while Jackson had tried to destroy her world, he had inadvertently given her the opportunity to build something even stronger. She looked at her father's watch, ticking steadily on her wrist. "I did it, Dad," she whispered. "I protected your legacy, and now I'm going to build my own." As the sun set over Toronto, casting a warm glow through her window, Dakota felt a sense of peace. The trial was over, but her journey was just beginning, and this time, she would be the architect of her own destiny. In the weeks following the trial, Dakota found herself in a whirlwind of activity. The media frenzy had died down, but the repercussions of Jackson's fraud continued to ripple through Toronto's financial and social circles. One crisp morning, Dakota sat in her soon-to-be former home, surrounded by packing boxes. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed too large, too full of memories she was eager to leave behind. As she carefully wrapped a framed photo of her parents, her phone buzzed with a message from Tyler. "Meeting at the firm in an hour. Important news. Can you make it?" Dakota hesitated. She'd been on extended leave from the architecture firm, unsure if she even wanted to return, but curiosity got the better of her. "I'll be there," she replied. An hour later, she found herself in the familiar conference room of Matthews & Associates, the firm her father had built from the ground up. The partners were all there, along with Tyler and a few key team members. The atmosphere was tense, expectant. "Dakota," Gregory Pearson, the senior partner, began. "Thank you for coming. We've been following your situation closely, and first let me say how sorry we all are for what you've been through." Dakota nodded, bracing herself for what she assumed would be a gentle push towards resignation. "But that's not why we called you here," Gregory continued. "We've been discussing the firm's future, and we believe it's time for a change in leadership. We'd like to offer you the position of managing partner." The room fell silent. Dakota blinked, sure she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Tyler stepped forward, a grin spreading across his face. "We've all agreed, Dakota. Your handling of the crisis, your integrity throughout the trial, it's exactly the kind of leadership this firm needs." "But I've been away for months," Dakota protested. "And the scandal has only proven your resilience and commitment to truth," another partner chimed in. "Clients have been calling, asking specifically for you to lead their projects. They trust you, Dakota. We all do." As the reality of the offer sank in, Dakota felt a mix of emotions: pride, fear, excitement. She thought of her father, of the legacy he'd built, and of the chance to not just continue it, but to elevate it. I need some time to think about it," she said finally. Gregory nodded understandingly. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Dakota, remember, sometimes the best way to rebuild is from the top." As she left the office, her mind racing with possibilities, Dakota's phone buzzed again. It was Brooklyn. "Got a minute? There's something you need to see." Intrigued, Dakota redirected her Uber to Brooklyn's office. When she arrived, she found her lawyer looking unusually excited. "You're not going to believe this," Brooklyn said, ushering her in. "Remember those fake charities Jackson set up?" Dakota nodded, a familiar knot forming in her stomach at the mention of her ex-husband's schemes. "Well, it turns out not all of them were completely fake. One of them, a small foundation for aspiring young architects. It's real, and it's been doing good work." Brooklyn pulled up a website on her computer. "Look at this. They've been providing scholarships and mentorship programs for underprivileged kids interested in architecture and urban planning." Dakota leaned in, scrolling through images of smiling students and impressive design projects. I had no idea," she murmured. "Neither did Jackson, apparently," Brooklyn said. "It seems the person he tasked with setting it up actually made it legitimate. The foundation's board has reached out. They want to distance themselves from Jackson, obviously, but they also want to keep the work going. They're hoping you might consider taking over as the foundation's director." Dakota sat back, overwhelmed. In one morning, she'd been offered a chance to lead her father's firm and an opportunity to make a real difference in young architects' lives. It was as if the universe was laying out a path for her, a way to turn the pain of the past months into something meaningful. "What do you think?" Brooklyn asked gently. Dakota took a deep breath. I think it's time to start building something new." The next few months passed in a blur of activity. Dakota threw herself into her new roles with a passion that surprised even her. As managing partner of Matthews and Associates, she brought a fresh perspective, emphasizing sustainable design and community-focused projects. The firm's reputation soared, attracting both high-profile clients and talented young architects eager to work under her leadership. But it was her work with the newly renamed Future Foundations that truly ignited her passion. Dakota poured her heart into revamping the scholarship program, expanding its reach and impact. She found herself spending evenings and weekends mentoring young architects, remembering the guidance her own father had provided her. One Saturday afternoon, Dakota stood in a community center in one of Toronto's underserved neighborhoods. Around her, a group of teenage students huddled over drafting tables, excitedly discussing their designs for a new local park. "Ms. Matthews," a shy voice called. Dakota turned to see Maria, a brilliant 16-year-old whose talent reminded Dakota of herself at that age. "Can you look at my design? I'm not sure about this section here." As Dakota reviewed Maria's work, offering gentle suggestions and encouragement, she felt a warm sense of purpose wash over her. This, she realized, was healing in its purest form, taking the pain of her past and transforming it into hope for the future. Later that evening, as she was locking up the center, she received a text from Matthew Chen, Brooklyn's brother. Over the past months, their friendship had deepened, bonding over their shared love of art and design. "Heard you were in the neighborhood? Dinner at Rosalinda's? I promise not to bore you with tales of my latest exhibition." Dakota smiled, a flutter of excitement in her chest. "Only if you promise to bore me with tales of your latest exhibition. See you in 20. As she walked to the restaurant, Dakota marveled at how much her life had changed. The pain of Jackson's betrayal was still there, a dull ache that flared up in quiet moments. But it no longer defined her. Instead, she felt like she was finally becoming the person she was always meant to be. At Rosalinda's, a cozy vegan spot they both loved, Matthew was waiting with a warm smile and a glass of her favorite wine. As they settled into easy conversation, Dakota found herself studying his face. The kind eyes, the laugh lines, the way his whole expression lit up when he talked about his art. "Earth to Dakota," Matthew teased, waving a hand in front of her face. "You okay? You seemed lost in thought there." Dakota felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Sorry, I was just thinking about how different everything is now. A year ago, I thought my life was falling apart. And now, Matthew prompted gently. "Now I feel like I'm finally building something real, something that matters." Matthew reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You've always been building something real, Dakota. It's who you are, an architect in every sense of the word." As their eyes met, Dakota felt a spark of possibility, of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed insistently. It was Tyler. "Dakota, I'm so sorry to interrupt your evening, but we've got a situation. The waterfront project. There's been a major issue with the environmental impact assessment. We need you at the office." Dakota sighed, torn between duty and the moment she'd been sharing with Matthew. But Matthew just smiled understandingly. "Go, save the day. That's what you do best. But maybe we can continue this conversation another time, over dinner at my place." With a grateful nod, Dakota hurried out, her mind already shifting to problem-solving mode. As she hailed a taxi to the office, she realized that the constant balancing act, the challenges, the need to adapt, this was the life she'd chosen. And despite the interruptions and late nights, she wouldn't have it any other way. As winter melted into spring, Dakota found herself busier than ever. The waterfront project had become a major focus, with her team working tirelessly to address the environmental concerns while maintaining the innovative design that had won them the contract. One morning, as she pored over the latest revisions in her office, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see Alberta standing hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a large envelope. "Alberta?" Dakota said, surprised. They hadn't spoken since a brief, awkward encounter at a charity event months ago. "Come in. What brings you here?" Alberta settled into a chair, looking uncomfortable. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Dakota, about everything that happened, and I wanted to apologize again, properly this time." Dakota nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I enabled Jackson's behavior for years," Alberta admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I always made excuses for him, always believed the best. I should have seen what was happening. I should have stopped it." Alberta, Dakota said gently. Jackson was an adult. His choices were his own. Perhaps. But I contributed to the environment that allowed him to think he could get away with it. Alberta straightened, a hint of her old strength returning. That's why I'm here. I want to make amends. She handed Dakota the envelope. Inside was a series of legal documents and bank statements. I'm liquidating a significant portion of my personal assets, Alberta explained. I want to donate it to your foundation, to help those young architects you're mentoring. Dakota leafed through the papers, her eyes widening at the figures. Alberta, it's incredibly generous. But are you sure? Alberta nodded firmly. It's the right thing to do. And I hoped it might be a first step towards rebuilding our relationship. If you're open to that. As Dakota looked at her former mother-in-law, she saw not the haughty society matron who had often made her feel inadequate, but a woman trying to make amends, to find her own path to redemption. She reached out, squeezing Alberta's hand. I'd like that. Later that afternoon, Dakota met with Brooklyn to discuss the legal implications of Alberta's donation. As they wrapped up, Brooklyn hesitated, then said, There's something else you should know. I received a letter from Jackson. Dakota felt her stomach tighten. What does he want? He's eligible for parole soon, Brooklyn explained. He's requested a meeting with you before his hearing, says he wants to apologize in person. Dakota leaned back in her chair, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. Do you think I should meet with him? Brooklyn shrugged. That's entirely up to you, Dakota. Legally, there's no obligation. But if it would help you find closure, it might be worth considering. As Dakota left Brooklyn's office, her phone buzzed with a message from Matthew. Cooking class tonight? Promise not to set anything on fire this time. She smiled, remembering their disastrous attempt at making paella last week. Despite the burnt rice and overcooked seafood, it had been one of the best evenings she'd had in years. Their relationship was progressing slowly, thoughtfully, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared passions. As she typed her reply, only if we stick to cold dishes, Dakota realized she was at a crossroads. The offer to meet with Jackson felt like the final thread connecting her to her old life. Cutting it could be the last step in fully embracing her new path. But as she walked through the bustling streets of Toronto, past buildings she'd helped design and others she dreamed of reimagining, Dakota knew that her past would always be a part of her. It had shaped her, challenged her, and ultimately made her stronger. The question wasn't whether to erase it, but how to integrate it into the beautiful, complex structure of her new life. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She would meet with Jackson. Not for him, but for herself. To close that chapter fully and face the future with no loose ends. As the sun set over the city skyline, casting long shadows and painting the buildings in hues of gold and pink, Dakota felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever came next, she was ready. She had built a new foundation, strong and true, and on it, she would continue to create, to grow, and to thrive. The day of Dakota's meeting with Jackson arrived with a mix of trepidation and resolve. She'd chosen a neutral location, a small conference room at Brooklyn's law firm, hoping the professional setting would help maintain emotional distance. As she waited, Dakota found herself fidgeting with her father's watch. She thought about how much had changed since she'd last seen Jackson. Her career was thriving, her foundation was making a real difference, and her relationship with Matthew was blossoming into something beautiful and authentic. The door opened, and Jackson entered, escorted by a guard. He looked older, his once impeccable appearance now shabby and worn. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Dakota felt a flicker of the connection they'd once shared. Dakota, Jackson said softly, taking a seat across from her. Thank you for agreeing to see me. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. You said you wanted to apologize. I'm here to listen. Jackson took a deep breath. I've had a lot of time to think in prison. About the choices I made, the people I hurt. I know saying sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I am truly deeply sorry for what I did to you, to our clients, to everyone. Dakota studied him, searching for signs of the manipulation she'd become so familiar with. But all she saw was a broken man, finally facing the consequences of his actions. I appreciate your apology, Jackson, she said carefully. But I need to know. Why? Why did you do it? He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. It started small, a little creative accounting to boost my numbers at work, but then it grew, and I couldn't stop. I was afraid of losing everything. My job, my reputation, you. But you lost it all anyway, Dakota pointed out. I know, he said quietly, and I deserve it. But Dakota, you have to believe me. What we had was real. I loved you. I still do. Dakota felt a pang in her chest, not of longing, but of grief for the life they might have had. If you ever loved me, Jackson, you'll use this second chance to make amends. Not just to me, but to everyone you hurt. Jackson nodded, tears in his eyes. I'm trying. I've been working with the authorities, helping them track down all the money, and I've started a program in here, teaching financial literacy to other inmates. As they continued talking, Dakota felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The anger and betrayal that had fueled her for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of closure. I don't forgive you, Jackson, she said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm grateful for this conversation. It's helped me realize how far I've come, and that I'm ready to let go of the past. As she stood to leave, Jackson called out, Dakota, I know I have no right to ask, but are you happy? She paused at the door, thinking of her thriving career, her foundation, and Matthew's warm smile. Yes, Jackson, I'm building a life I love, and that's the best revenge I could have ever asked for. Weeks after her meeting with Jackson, Dakota found herself standing on a stage at the University of Toronto, addressing a room full of aspiring architects. It was the launch of a new initiative by her foundation, partnering with the university to provide mentorship and internship opportunities. Architecture isn't just about designing buildings, she told the eager young faces before her. It's about creating spaces that shape lives, that foster community, that stand as testaments to human potential. Each of you has the power to leave a lasting mark on this world. Use it wisely. As she fielded questions after her speech, Dakota caught sight of Matthew slipping into the back of the auditorium. He gave her a thumbs up, his pride evident even from a distance. Later, as they walked hand in hand through the campus, Matthew asked, So, how does it feel to be inspiring the next generation? Dakota laughed. Terrifying. Exhilarating. I keep waiting for someone to realize I don't have all the answers. That's exactly why you're perfect for this, Matthew insisted. You're not pretending to know everything. You're showing them how to learn, how to grow, how to build something meaningful from adversity. They stopped by a fountain, the sound of water providing a soothing backdrop. I have something to ask you, Matthew said, suddenly looking nervous. Dakota's heart skipped a beat. Oh, I've been offered a residency in Paris, 6 months at the Cité Internationale des Arts. It's an incredible opportunity, but... He trailed off, looking at her intently. But what? Dakota prompted, though she had a feeling she knew where this was going. But I don't want to be away from you for that long, Matthew admitted. So I was wondering, would you consider coming with me? Not for the whole time. I know you have commitments here. But maybe we could split our time? You could work on expanding your foundation internationally, maybe take on some projects in Europe? Dakota's mind raced with possibilities. 6 months ago, the idea of uprooting her life would have terrified her. But now it felt like an adventure. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how easily the answer came. Yes, I'd love to. As Matthew pulled her into a joyful embrace, Dakota felt a sense of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. She was stepping into the unknown, but this time she was doing it on her own terms, with someone who truly supported and understood her. The Parisian autumn was in full swing as Dakota stood on the balcony of their rented apartment in the Marais district. The city sprawled before her, a beautiful chaos of old and new, much like her own life. The past few months had been a whirlwind. She'd split her time between Toronto and Paris, overseeing her firm remotely while exploring opportunities for her foundation in Europe. Matthew's residency had been a resounding success, his art gaining recognition in galleries across the city. As she sipped her morning coffee, Dakota reflected on how much had changed. Her firm had just won a major contract to redesign a sustainable community in Rotterdam. The foundation had partnered with a French organization to provide opportunities for young architects from underprivileged backgrounds. And personally, She and Matthew had grown closer than ever, their relationship deepening amidst the romance and challenges of life abroad. Her phone buzzed with a message from Tyler. "Great news! The Toronto City Council approved our proposal for the affordable housing project. We did it, boss." Dakota grinned, feeling a surge of pride. This project had been close to her heart, a chance to provide quality, sustainable housing for those who needed it most. It felt like the perfect amalgamation of her professional skills and personal values. As she typed out a response to Tyler, she heard Matthew stirring inside. He joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Good morning," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Ready for today?" Dakota took a deep breath. Today was the opening of their joint project, an installation that combined Matthew's sculptures with Dakota's architectural designs, creating an immersive experience that told the story of rebuilding and renewal. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, leaning into his embrace. Hours later, as they stood in the gallery surrounded by friends, colleagues, and art enthusiasts, Dakota felt a sense of completion. The installation was a success, with critics praising the seamless integration of art and architecture, the powerful narrative of resilience and growth. As she mingled with the crowd, Dakota overheard snippets of conversation in a mix of French and English, discussing the themes of the work. Many drew parallels to her own story, which had become something of a legend in both the business and art worlds. "Ms. Matthews," a young journalist approached her, "your work speaks of transformation and new beginnings. Looking back, how do you feel about the journey that brought you here?" Dakota paused, considering the question. She thought of the pain of Jackson's betrayal, the challenge of rebuilding her life, the joy of discovering new passions and deepening old ones. She thought of her father's legacy, which she'd not only preserved but expanded upon in ways she never could have imagined. "Every experience, good or bad, has shaped me," she said finally. "I've learned that life isn't about avoiding cracks in the foundation. It's about how you repair them, how you build something even stronger on top of them. I'm grateful for every part of my journey, because it's led me here, to a life full of purpose, love, and endless possibilities." As the evening wound down, Dakota found a quiet moment with Matthew. They stood before the centerpiece of their installation, a sculpture of a phoenix rising from abstract architectural forms, symbolizing rebirth and renewal. "You know," Matthew said softly, "when I first met you, I saw this fire in you. Even when you were at your lowest, there was this undeniable strength. I'm so proud of you, Dakota, of everything you've built, everything you are." Dakota felt tears prick at her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, without everyone who believed in me." As they left the gallery hand in hand, stepping out into the Parisian night, Dakota felt a profound sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, full of new challenges and opportunities, but she was ready for it all. She had built a life on a foundation of integrity, passion, and love, a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. The story of Dakota Matthews, architect, philanthropist, survivor, wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But as she walked through the city of lights with the man she loved, she knew that whatever came next, she had the strength and the vision to create something beautiful. ¿Qué le ha parecido la historia? Por favor, deja un comentario con tu opinión. No olvides suscribirte al canal. Seguro que habrá nuevos vídeos en este canal que te sorprenderán. Dale un like y activa la campanita de notificaciones para que no te pierdas nuestros próximos videos. Nos vemos pronto.